Dear Lord, anoint this word. I honor the Lord for the privilege of coming tonight. Thank God for our presiding bishop, Bishop Blake, and to the first and second assistant presiding bishops, respectively, members of the General Board, Bishop Sheard, and the Board of Bishops, to Lady May Blake, and all of you that serve in the feminine side of our ministry, my own bishop, Bishop Rufus Kiles, and his wife, Louisa, and my supervisor, Supervisor Lena McLean. I've been asked to make my remarks short, so I'll call your attention to 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 16, Acts chapter 4 and verse 20. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 16 records, "For though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of, for necessity is laid upon me. But woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel." Acts chapter 4 and verse 20, "For we cannot but speak the things that we have seen and heard. Why must we preach?" It is interesting to note that Paul, the great missionary, went on 4 missionary journeys. While on these journeys, Paul's mission was to preach the gospel. His mission was to preach the good news of Jesus Christ throughout the Gentile nations. As he traveled from city to city and from place to place, Paul would found churches. He would set up churches, and he would stay with that church until it was strong enough to operate without him. Then he would move on to yet other places and set up other churches. It is said that when Paul first went to Corinth, that there were many things at work to try to hinder and hold up the power and progress of the church. He began his teachings at first by preaching in the synagogues. However, he was put out of them and was compelled to give his instructions in private homes. It is said that this church at Corinth was at best described as a hell-raising church. Paul heard some disturbing news concerning the state of things at the church, and therefore he wrote this first epistle to address the many issues that plagued the Corinthian church. One of the problems that was prevalent in this Corinthian church was there were those there who could not understand the resurrection. They had mistaken views concerning the resurrection. They could not understand how one could be dead. The diastolic and systolic beat of one's heart having come to a stop. And then to say that he got up again on the third day. Their Grecian logic, their Greek mentality would not allow them to grasp the idea that one could be dead and 3 days later get up. But I heard Paul say unto them, "If Christ be not risen, then our preaching and our labor and our faith is in vain." There was a second problem prevalent in this Corinthian church. There were those there who ate the meat that had been offered to idol gods. And this practice was causing the weaker Christians to stumble and fall by the wayside. Paul heard this news, and he said to them in so many words, Now, if you eat this meat, it won't make you any better. And if you don't eat it, it won't make you any worse. But if eating this meat offends your brother, then don't you eat it any longer. And still yet, there was a third problem in this Corinthian church. There was what I have identified as the party spirit. No, they were not Democrats or Republicans or Tea Party participants, But some followed Apollos, some followed Paul, some followed Cephas, and still yet others claimed to be followers of Jesus Christ. Paul heard this news, and he said to them, "What's wrong with you? Is Christ divided? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul?" He said, "I thank God I didn't baptize none of you. I'm nothing big. I'm just a preacher. Apollos and Cephas, they're nothing big. We're all just preachers. We don't have the power to save anybody. This is what happens. I plant, another waters, but only God can give the increase." It is then that Paul speaks the immortal words of our text. "For though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of, for necessity is laid upon me. But woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel." Paul was saying to them, in essence, it would have been better for me had I not been born than for me to refuse to tell the good news of Jesus Christ. Paul wanted them to understand the seriousness of the call to preach. And oh yes, we preachers, we must understand the seriousness of the call to preach. God has not called us to be gospel comedians, nor has he called us to be ecclesiastical clowns, but he has called us to preach the gospel. Yet the question remains, why must we preach? Is preaching still necessary? Isn't it outdated? Isn't preaching antiquated? Why must we resort to listening to the gospel in order for us to make it? In this age of technology, in this age of computers, in this age of iPads and smartphones, isn't that enough for us to live by? Why must we resort to listening to the gospel in order for us to make it? In this age of the philosophical views of secular humanism, which declare that man does not need God and he can solve his own problems, can't Iana fix our life? Where is Dr. Phil? Why must we resort to listening to the gospel in order for us to make it? In this age of psychologists like Skinner and others with their theories on behavior modification, isn't that enough for us to live by? Well, I've got 3 reasons, and I'm going to hurry to my seat. First of all, we must preach because our times demand it. My brothers and sisters, we are living in some terrible times. We're living in a day when sin and evil are riding on the high cloud, while righteousness and morality are at their lowest. Ours is a time when men are not concerned about the needs of their brother. Ours is a time when we have too many priests and Levites who pass by on the other side. Ours is a time of drug abuse, when drugs have infiltrated even our elementary schools. Therefore, I came to St. Louis to declare that preaching is in order. Ours is a time of babies having babies. I said preaching is in order. Ours is a time when if a poor boy steals a bicycle, he goes to prison. But if a rich boy shoots a president, he goes to a nursing home. I said preaching is in order. Therefore, we must preach because our times demand it. But not only must we preach because our times demand it, but we must preach because man can only be saved through the preaching of the gospel. No, you are not saved by your works. No, you are not saved by keeping the law. No, you are not saved by keeping the commandments. For it is by grace, through faith are we saved, and not of works, lest any man should boast. God sent his word through the preacher. Had he sent it only by radio, you may not have been listening. Had he sent it only by television, you may not have been watching. Had he sent it only by newspaper, you may not have read it. But he sent his word through the preacher. Thus I hear Paul saying unto them, how then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how can they believe in him in whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without a preacher? That gives us to know you must have a sent preacher in order for us to hear. You must hear in order for us to believe. You must believe in order for us to call. And whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Shout yes. Clap your hands and say yes, Lord. So we must preach because our times demand it. We must preach because man can only be saved through the preaching of the gospel. We must preach because necessity is laid upon us. Paul said, though I preach the gospel, I have no cause to become arrogant and haughty and lifted up in pride, for necessity was laid upon me. Truth of the matter is, I really didn't want to preach. I was a protester, not a preacher. And I was on my way down to Damascus to further persecute the Christian movement. But something happened to me between leaving and arriving in Damascus. And I've never been the same ever since. He said necessity was laid upon me. I heard Moses say, I was minding my own business on the backside of a mountain, keeping watch over my father-in-law's flock, when I heard the voice out of the bush said, take off your shoes. The ground you're standing on is holy ground. Go tell Pharaoh, let my people go. He said necessity was laid upon me. I heard Jeremiah. Jeremiah said, I'm not going back to that church. I'm not going to deal with those devilish deacons or those tricky trustees. He said, I'm not going back. But that night, it was like fire. Therefore, we must preach because our times demand it. We must preach because man can only be saved through the preaching of the gospel. We must preach because necessity is laid upon us. I've got to close. But I believe over in the book of Acts that they told Peter and John, they said, don't preach anymore. Said to Peter and John, don't teach anymore about Jesus and his love. They said to Peter and John, you got to stop that preaching thing because you are upsetting our economy. You got to stop preaching because you are about to turn our world upside down. They said to Peter and John, stop preaching. But I heard Peter and John say unto them, we cannot but speak the things that we have seen and heard. They said, we'd like to stop preaching, but we can't because we've seen too much. We saw him open blinded eyes. We saw him make the lame to walk. We saw him open deaf ears. We'd like to stop preaching, but we can't because we've seen too much. We saw him when he ascended up to God. And then we saw him when he appeared in the house without ever opening up the door. We cannot stop preaching because we've seen too much. But not only have we seen too much, but we cannot stop preaching because we've heard too much. We heard him when he said, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but shall have everlasting life. I can't hear nobody. We like to stop preaching, but we can't because we've heard too much. We heard him when he said, take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I'm meek and lowly, and my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. I can't hear nobody say, yes, Lord. We'd like to stop preaching, but we can't because we heard too much. We heard him when he said, I am the resurrection and the life, and though a man die, yet shall he live again. But if he lives and believes in me, he'll never die. I can't hear nobody shout yes. We like to stop preaching, but we can't because we've seen too much and we've heard too much. But not only have we seen too much, not only have we heard too much, but we cannot stop preaching because we felt too much. It was on the day of Pentecost that the Holy Ghost came in like a mighty rushing wind. We felt the power of the Holy Ghost running through our bodies. We found ourselves speaking in unknown tongues. I can't hear nobody shout yes. We cannot stop preaching because we've seen too much, we've heard too much, and we felt too much. And I don't know about you, but I just believe when you've seen something, when you've heard something, and when you felt something, you don't mind telling the world what you've seen, what you've heard, and what you felt. I've seen something, I've heard something, I've felt something, I've seen the lightning flashing, heard the thunder roar, felt sin breakers dashing, trying to conquer my soul. I heard the voice of Jesus telling me, fight on, shout yes,